Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Big Bite Baits, Rick with the Coach. I hope everybody's doing well today. Brandon, talk to me, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, man. Doing
You
good.
survived Thanksgiving, I see.
Yes.
Yeah, I did too. We're in the midst of the holiday season, and we're going to talk about a lot of things in the next couple of weeks. I know today I'm going to do a little show and then on some bait. And then next week, I think you told me we were going to talk a little bit about some Christmas specials and things that Big Bite's going to offer. So you can tune in to see about all that for present-wise. There'll be some nice offers there for sure. But before we get into bait, let's just spend a second and talk about the new hat that we have. And I talked about this last time, but I just want to give it a second shout out because we were a long time getting it in. It's an OC cap. It's like an olive green. I believe they got a name for that green.
It's olive.
Olive green, and then it's got a tan back mesh, and it's got obviously the leather patch on. And it's a real nice quality hat. It's an OC. And I've got one of them. I really like it. Fits really well. Wears good. But you can buy that right now on the internet for $24.99, and they're readily available. And we have plenty of them in stock. And I might be wrong, but I think this would make a really good Christmas present for sure.
I think so too.
Excuse me. Anyway, my daughter made her commitment there. So anyway, let's continue to move on. Anyway, you've got a question that you wanted to ask me, and I kind of wanted to build today's show off of that question. So read that question to me again that you had that we were going to use.
All right, so we've been talking a lot about swim baits the last couple of weeks. So this was a little bit of a change of gears. So I know a lot of guys, some like to throw a jig, but there's a couple different kinds of jigs you can throw. So the question is, when would you throw a finesse jig instead of a full profile jig?
Well, that's kind of an interesting question, and I kind of based our show off of that today because I'm gonna go over and talk a little bit about a finesse jig, but then I'm gonna throw a question out to the people that watch this about the finesse jig and some things to do with it. But typically, I personally fish a finesse jig a lot of times when the bite is kind of tough. Now, I think another thing that dictates a finesse jig is the species of fish that you're fishing for. Obviously, if you're a smallmouth guy or a spotted bass guy, then you might use a finesse jig year-round, okay? If you're a largemouth guy, as I said just a minute ago, you usually use a finesse jig a lot of times when the bite gets tough and you're trying to figure out a way to make them bite. But there are some bass guys out there that use it year-round, fish docks with it, and do that type of thing. So I think there's a lot of different answers for that. The question I want to pose to the crowd today that's watching is, do any of you guys use that in the fall when the water gets cooler? Something to try that's a little different. I had a guy tell me the other day that he'd been catching lots of fish throwing a finesse jig this time of year when the water cooled down because he said he could work it a lot slower and it seemed the profile wasn't near as big and he seemed to match the fresh hatch. And he got a lot more bites that way. So something to think about. I don't know. I'm not one that throws a finesse jig in the fall, to be honest with you.
And I think, too, you could go to a finesse jig in a high pressure,
Yeah, I know that's definitely the case. Anytime the fish are getting beat on pretty hard, especially if you're trying to downsize. So let's just take a look at some things that we have that you could fish on a finesse jig and talk a little bit about them in just a minute. So the first thing I start off with was a finesse jig. And then obviously I start off with one of my favorite baits on it. This is a 3.5-inch fighting frog, the smallest model of the fighting frog we make. And I know that this works really well because me and Dean Rojas has talked about this a lot. And he likes to fish this on the back of this particular type of bait like this. And it works really well. And he likes that bruised melon color in it. Definitely this is something that I think is a main player with that. I know when I fish it, I use this trailer normally on it. But we do have some other trailers that you could use. I think they'll work just as good as that. All right, so you could possibly choose a 3.5-inch college craw if you want to stay with that crawfish pattern, and it'll also do the job real well for you. And it also has a lot of action, so that's another option I think that works real well on this jig. Okay, or you could do a 3-inch kamikaze craw. So we're just gonna crawl out now, But I'm gonna get away from the craw in just a second. And but that's another option that you could choose. And of course, both of these baits come in a large array of colors, so you can pretty much find the color that you need to match your jig. And I think that's important as well. Okay, and then you might can just go old school. And old school's not bad. Just in talking to some people this last 6 months or so after we had a show on jigs, I was really, to be honest with you, surprised, excuse me, at the number of people that still fish the old school chunk. And we make a 2.5-inch chunk that'll work really well on that Bitsy jig. And once again, we're still in the crawfish mode, but I look at this as a little bit different than the actual crawfish type bait. So that might be something that you might want to try. Sometimes old is good, you know? So something to think about anyway. And then if you're just feeling kind of antsy and want to do something different, so I always like to give you something that's like a sleeping type bait, one that you don't really think about. We decided, me and you after talking, that we thought that you could take a Yo Daddy and pinch it down just a little bit and put it on there, and it would work just as well, and you'd have a lot of action. And if you want to even swim it a little bit, then this would swim really good behind it and give you some good action. So I just thought that was kind of interesting as well. I'd like to get Russ Lane's thoughts on that. Maybe we can get him on here in the next few weeks and talk to him a little bit about that. But definitely, I thought that was something that I thought was pretty interesting when you talk about it. So you said you had a little feedback. What you got that you wanted to feedback on that with?
Well, that's the Yo Daddy thing was something that I had passed on to me a little bit. One of our pro staff guys and I were talking not long ago, and he just said that he's been using it as a jig trailer, and especially on a finesse jig. It's a slimmer profile than like a fighting frog.
Well, I know it works really well. Like if you're punching, that bait's dynamite. It's a punching bait. I have punched it, and it works really good doing that with it. So that's another way to fish it. I think would be good.
I just think, it has a real live action claws on it, and it's just something maybe you might not normally see other guys use it for.
Right. So that's just some ideas I had today on the finesse jig that you might can try. I'm still going to kind of hit on the fact that in the fall, personally, me and you both, I think, like to use a moving bait just because you can cover more ground, and obviously the shadder's bottled up in the backs of the creeks, down the flats, and you can target them. And that kind of goes along with what we dealt with last week talking with Garrett Paquette. But anyway, needless to say, give us some feedback on that. Now we're fixing to talk about a few questions here that you've got. If you've got a question you'd like to add today, let's get it in real quick and let me see if we can't answer a couple of online questions today. We've got a couple that we saved from our last show, and we'd like to have a couple of new things to talk on. So talk to me. What do we have today question-wise?
All right, so let's see. JB was asking, and I think we did an episode on this not long ago, of maybe ways you'd use a swim on in this time of year in that fall to winter transition.
Yeah, we did. We did talk about that. We talked about, you can correct me if I'm wrong, putting it on a chatterbait. I thought that was one of the things we talked about, definitely using it. We talked about possibly using it on a spinnerbait around shad. And I had a guy tell me the other day that he was using a swim on an Alabama rig of all things. We've talked about different kinds of baits for an Alabama rig. I never even thought about it. I don't see why not. It's a trailer bait, So I thought that was kind of interesting, something totally different. I mean, way off the wall.
Yeah, I know, traditionally it'd be a spinnerbait, chatterbait kind of,
no
maybe
doubt.
a swim jig.
Yeah,
or
no
something.
doubt, yeah.
So, and then this is kind of sets up, just sort of a back to what we were kind of covering was maybe some of the type of cover that you fish around, areas you target this time of year, things, guys should be kind of looking for.
Yeah, I would think you could take that finesse, and we're talking about the finesse jig once again. I would think you could throw this around boat docks and do real well. Blowdowns, wood. It's even small enough. I know that it works real well on rocky type places. Riprap or either rocky points. I think you could target those kind of places. And then even on hard clay possibly. I mean, I know here, like the shad sometimes like to relate to that hard clay. So this might be a good option to throw on that hard clay. Any of those type might work really well. Those type of situations. Do you have any thoughts on that you might want to add? I mean,
I think when the water gets cooler, especially, and lots of lakes, ours doesn't always set up like this, but as the fish, they'll move to maybe the mouths of pockets or into pockets and stuff. And I think they relate to steeper banks in the colder months.
So you could throw it on steep banks.
Just throw it up against that sort of.
I know one time I was up at Wheeler Lake in North Alabama, and that was the way to catch them. You could take a Bitsy jig and throw it on those steep, high walls, And that's how the fish, you couldn't get a bite no other way. That just seemed to be the way they were relating to it. That was in the fall of the year. And that you mentioned it.
I think that even some of the tour level pros, I've seen some guys do something that's a little different called like floating a jig, especially in current. They use something that's a lighter weight or smaller jig and it just, floats
They just kind of let it fall and wait for the bite.
Right.
And that's kind of interesting. That's kind of a reaction deal.
Not necessarily just everybody thinks of a jig as a bottom bait.
Right. Using it more kind of in between a swim jig and a bottom bait.
Right.
It's kind of interesting. So something to think about. We got any questions coming in?
Yeah, let's see. We had one. Doobie3X was asking about were there any crappie baits released? Maybe.
As far as a new bait, yeah, we've got the Linder Panfish Minnow. I think is a really good looking new crappie bait, and actually sales on it's been pretty good. It's different. It's got the difference in it is it's similar to a howl fly. But the difference is the lead head is pointed like a minnow head jig rather than a ball head jig. And a lot of crappie anglers prefer the pointed jig rather than the ball type jig. And I think that's just one of those things. It's to each your own. But I think they both have their place. But if you'd like to, as far as, and there were several new colors that we put in several baits that you could look at possibly just by going on the internet, looking at our panfish baits and looking for the new colors. I know that in the swim on
in 2 sizes.
Yeah, we did that, and that was another thing that we did. So there's several things out there that's new, but I think of all the new ideas, I really like that Linder Panfish Minnow. That thing's pretty neat.
It is, and that's I think there's some crossover there too, especially this time of year for some of the northern guys that maybe use those panfish baits for like ice fishing.
Yeah, possibly so. And the color Wildcat seems to be a really good seller. I know that just on calling on customers, that seems to be the one they are all wanting. So something different, if that'll give you any help there, for sure.
Let's see. Some good feedback, guys, talking about using finesse jigs, parting in February and March, fishing riprap and rock.
Okay, kind of what we talked about. So we were right on track with that. I'm glad to hear that. So that's definitely good, for sure.
But that pretty much
winds us up for today.
Yeah, that wraps
well,
up.
That sounds good. So what we're going to do, so everybody know, I'll go ahead and start kind of preparing everyone. We'll have a show next week and the next week, and then we're going to be off the air until we come back after the first of the year. We'll be back on the Monday after the first. We're going to take the holiday break off. I'm going to be out of town traveling, so I'm not going to be here to be able to do it. And obviously the plant will be shut down part of that time. So definitely we'll do this week and then the next 2 weeks, and then we'll take some time off and then see everybody back after the new year. But until then, until next Monday, everybody have a nice week, and we'll look forward to seeing you then.